went looking for trouble. And boy, I found her. She's in love with herself. She likes the dark. Grey Wolf Studios.
Now we're going to get back to the wines. We were talking earlier about the numbers on the side of this, and one of the numbers after 410 here is 1Y. There's two different ways that the windings can be done inside of a brushless motor. They can either be done in what's called a Y wind, which is usually designated by the letter Y, but it's actually spelled WYE. And there's also the other variant is called a delta wind, and I'm not going to get into the specifics of how they're wound because I don't really understand it. Again, it's one of those things you don't need to understand. You just need to know the basic differences. Really, there's so much speculation and conjecture out there when it comes to Y versus delta wind motors. Which one's better? Which one's more efficient? There's nobody can agree. You'll see one place claim that that their test revealed that the Y wind was 1% more efficient, and another group will claim that they did another test that that found that delta winds are 0.5% more efficient than Y wind. Whatever, doesn't matter. None of that stuff matters. The only thing we care about is the fact that Y wind motors typically have a little more torque than delta wind motors, and delta wind motors typically have a little more top speed than Y wind motors. Again, we're back to that, if you want to pick up top speed, you have to sacrifice torque and vice versa. That's always a constant throughout electric RCs, or probably electrics motors, period. But electric RCs, that's always a constant. You have to give up one to get the other. So that's really all the time I'm going to spend talking about Y and delta wind, because that's really, I've used Y wind motors and I've used delta wind motors. I can't hardly tell the difference. Of course, I'm not a seasoned veteran racer either. Some racers will only use a 2.5 delta wind motor, and some will only use a 1.5 Y wind, and some of them will only use whatever. They all have their preferences, and they'll say, oh well, this one's better than this one because of that. And like I said, we're getting back into that whole, there's a whole mess of conjecture out there on the internet on one versus the other. It's really not important for us as beginners or even as intermediates. But that's kind of the basics of that. Motor temps. Let's talk about motor temps for a minute. Very quickly, and this is only going to take a minute. You never, as a general rule, you'll hear people say, slightly different temperatures, but to my knowledge, you really don't ever want your motor to go above about 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Preferably, you don't even want to get it quite that hot, but up to 160 is fine. If you get to the 160 point, you need to shut your RC off and you need to let it cool down, because that once you start getting up into the 170 plus Fahrenheit range, what happens is there's a couple of things that happen. One, the particular type of magnets that they use in brushless motors start to lose their magnetism. Well, I won't say they lose it. Their magnetism degrades a little bit past, I think it's 168 degrees Fahrenheit. At least I read that somewhere. At 168 degrees, they start to they start to degrade. Now, the loss isn't, there's a small percentage of the loss that's permanent. It'll never quite get back to 100%, but the majority of the loss isn't permanent if you do happen to go over that. Now, if you consistently go over it, you will, after a while, see a difference in the motor. You'll be able to feel a difference in the performance of the motor. It'll gradually get weaker and weaker as you do that. Now, if you get it too hot, what's going to happen is the glue that binds the magnets to the rotor is actually going to melt, and then the magnets are going to come flying off of the rotor, basically destroying the motor. So yeah, if your kit gets to 160 degrees, then I would shut it off and let it cool off. And preferably, if you have a fan on it, leave the fan running. Just don't run the RC, but leave the fan running. Leave it powered on or whatever, so that fan runs and cools the motor, because the motor is going to keep actually getting hotter for a couple of minutes after it stopped running, because it's not going to have the airflow going over it that it had when it was running. So that's why I say at 160, kill it. And if you got a fan, try to get a fan on it or blow on it. Try to do something to get those temps coming down back under 160, and then let it cool down quite a bit. If your motor gets too hot, then you have a problem with your gearing, and we'll get into that in a later section under gearing. But either that, or you might have a problem in your drive line somewhere. But at any rate, that's pretty much all I'm going to say about that. You never want the cutoff point's 160 in my book. You never go over 160. How to pick a motor. Well, the first thing you want to pick a motor on is based on what size kit you have. If you have a 1/10 scale kit, you obviously want a 1/10 scale motor. If you have a 1/8 scale kit, 1/8 scale motor, etc., etc. Excuse me. That's not the hard part to figure out. The hard part that for people to figure out is, well, what kV rating do I want, or what turn rating do I want in a motor, for my given kit? Well, kV rating really isn't that important, because, like we were talking about earlier, so the higher your kV rating is, the higher your top speed is. The lower it is, the better your torque is. So I guess you could choose your kV rating based on, what is your ultimate goal with the kit. Do you want acceleration? If you're going to be racing, acceleration is going to be really important. But you got to maintain some top speed even when you're racing. If you're just bashing, then top speed might be more important to you than acceleration. So, if you were racing, for example, you might want to settle on something like this 3800 kV motor. It's for a 1/10 scale motor, it's really torquey. 10 scale motors typically range, and now these aren't the absolute minimum and maximums. That this is the typical range, kV range for a 1/10 scale motor is somewhere between probably 3,000 and, let's say, 6,000 or 7,000 on the top end is probably pushing it for a 1/10 scale. A 3800 would be a really good motor for, like, say, racing, because it would be really torquey. It would have great acceleration. Would still have, the top end would be okay. Nothing, it's not going to be anywhere near what say a 5400 kV motor would be. But here's the thing about kV. Ultimately, kV is not that important, because you can always tweak your top speed and or your acceleration with gearing. Gearing is the best way to control how much acceleration and how much top speed you have. kV rating, not so much. It's not nearly as important. Now, like I said, if If you want to go with a KV, you know, if you know what the goal is you have in mind for your rig, then you may pick a KV rating that's kind of more appropriate. If if you really want a lot of low end torque, then you'd probably want to get something like a 3000, 3500, 3800, something like that. If you want a lot of top end speed, you might want to get a 5400 or even a 6800 or something like that. Um, Generally, what I tell people to do is go for a mid-range motor. Go for something in between, say, 3800 and 4800 kV. Um, Maybe even, you might even push up in the 5000, 5200 range, something like that. But I tend to go somewhere between 3800, or I'm sorry, 3500 and probably 4600 kV. I typically like to stay in that range. Though that kV range for a 110 scale motor is kind of middle of the road, and I adjust my speed and or torque with gearing, not motor kV. So if I had to give anybody advice on how to pick a motor based on kV rating, I would say get one that's middle of the road for the size motor that you're using, and then use gearing to modify your ultimate goal, whether it's speed or whether it's acceleration. And that's pretty much how you pick a motor, or how I pick a motor anyway. Not everybody obviously does that, but that's a good way to start as a beginner. Go something middle of the road. That way, through gearing, you can most likely find a happy medium somewhere. If you need more speed, well, you can use a bigger pinion. If you need more acceleration, use a smaller pinion. But anyway, that's basically what I've got for the actual motors themselves. Um, I think that's going to pretty much wrap this video up. If you have any questions about this video or about anything in general, actually, feel free to get a hold of me on my Facebook page. My Facebook page is www.facebook.com/Graywolf Studios 74. Or you can shoot me an email at graywolfstudios74@gmail.com. You can get a hold of me either one of those two ways, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. And again, like I said, I'm not a complete expert in the internal workings of electric motors, so I apologize if some of my descriptions were crude. There's some of this information, some of the information is really information that you don't need to know um, to be able to understand electric motors, unless you just like that kind of thing. So anyway, with that, I'm out of here, and catch my next video.